Hello, everybody. Gonna start doing what is essentially a crash course on the King's Indian defense. And so this will be the first video on it. It's just gonna be sort of a general survey of the ideas of the opening, a very, very brief history of the opening, and why you might want to consider playing it. And yeah, we'll just sort of go through a lot of options that white can play a lot of different setups. And later on, I think what I'll do with this series is make things more specialized as far as variations I would recommend for black or variations I would recommend for white, setups I would recommend for white. As we'll see, there are a number of setups in the King's Indian, especially for white. That sort of makes it unique, I would say. Just the sheer number of different things white can do and the move orders that he can use to get there. Okay, so let's start out by just making the opening moves that would characterize the King's Indian. So white opens with d4 and black plays knight f6, white plays c4 and black plays g6. And then white will play the knight out to c3, black plays bishop to g7. And then white occupies the center with e4. Okay, so the first thing to say about the King's Indian, just in a general sense, is that it is a hyper-modern opening. There's a lot of ways that you could characterize what a hyper-modern opening is. Um, the most important features of that, I would say, are that black is not rushing to occupy the center with pawns, and instead he is using his pawns to restrict the white center and eventually hit against that center, usually with a flank pawn advance, sometimes with a central pawn advance. And this will become clearer later as we look at the variations. And of course, black has fianchettoed his bishop here, which is another characteristic of hyper-modern openings. Okay, so with this last move, e4, white threatened to play the move e5 and attack the knight here on f6, which wouldn't have any good square to retreat to. So that's why in this position, normally black will play the move d6. The first point about that is that e5 would now be a mistake because black will take this pawn, white has nothing better than to recapture, and black will exchange the queens. And whichever way white recaptures on d1, let's say he recaptures with the knight, because if he recaptures with the king, whichever way white recaptures on d1 here, black will have a good move of the knight. Here actually he's going to win material because he's forking the pawns here on f2 and e5. So if if white took back with the knight, then I think black could consider playing knight to g4 there also. He could also play knight to d7, and now white only has one way to protect this pawn here that's being attacked on e5. He would have to play the move f4. And now black could hit back with f6 and open up the position for this bishop. And I think he would have a good game. I mean, maybe if you put this on a computer program, it will give you an even better sequence. This is just sort of what I'm coming up with off the top of my head. This video is not intended to be an exhaustive theoretical survey of the opening. So that's the first basic idea. It's also interesting that one of the champions of the King's Indian, Bobby Fischer, had a game in this position where he castled, maybe more than one game. I just remember one game that I looked at where he castled here, and so he allowed the move e5. And so this is like extremely hyper modern, I would say, because you are allowing white to push your pieces around, gain time, because now the knight on f6 has to move. But on the other hand, the argument is that white's center will become overextended. It's the same argument that we see in the Alekhine defense after e4 knight f6. And here black has the square e8 for the knight, and then later on he's going to chip away at the center here. And Fischer won a brilliant game from this position, where actually he proved that white's center was overextended, and with a series of accurate thrusts from his pawns, he just totally destroyed the center and opened up the game. Won quite quickly. Okay, so let's go back to this position. So black usually plays the move d6. And now white has a large choice. And before I get to the next move, I did mention Bobby Fischer's name. He is one of two world champions who played the King's Indian exclusively for a period of time. The other one is Gary Kasparov. So arguably, in my opinion, maybe the two greatest players to ever play chess, both played this opening and both had a lot of success with it. And it certainly appeals to counterattacking players, to players who are not content with symmetrical positions where the probability of a draw is much higher, because we're creating a lot of imbalances from the beginning, and that's due to the asymmetry of the setup. So, black has fianchettoed a bishop and basically developed in a completely different way from white. As we'll see, white could actually fianchetto his bishop on the king side, and normally he doesn't play e4 when he does this. So white can employ a number of different setups that sort of, maybe you could say, it reduces the number of imbalances that would be present in the position. But let's just go right on down the what's called the classical main line, and then we can come back to the earlier moves. And this classical main line I like to look at first with people who are just starting to learn about the opening, because it illustrates the long-term plans for both sides that crop up again and again in the King's Indian. So let's just go through these moves. So white plays knight to f3, natural move. Black castles, also natural. White develops his bishop to prepare castling. And now black plays the move e5. So he's hitting back at the center immediately, and a lot of people ask, well, why would you play e5 here? Because it seems like it makes your bishop on g7 a bad bishop. Shouldn't you play c5 instead? Because now you're keeping this diagonal open. And c5 is another line. Usually this will transpose to a Benoni or a Marazzi bind from the Accelerated Dragon. So, for example, the bind would occur after castles, and then black normally takes this, and then white would recapture. And here we have the characteristic features of the bind, which are these pawns here, which restrict black from playing his main pawn breaks, namely b5 eventually or d5 eventually. So that's basically a totally different opening from the Accelerated Dragon there. And then after c5, the way we would get a Benoni position is if white pushes on. And normally black will play the move e6 at some point, maybe now, and take on d5 here. And then once white recaptures, usually with the c pawn, we get a Benoni. So that sort of covers c5, I would say. So black plays e5 for a very concrete strategic goal, which we will see in a second. White usually castles here, as he has been planning to do for the last few moves. And black has tried a few setups here. Okay, so I'll just go through the sidelines very, very briefly. E takes d4 has been seen. It's similar to the line we just looked at with c5, except now, since he took with the e pawn, he has this open e file. But white has more space here, and I would say the practice has shown that white is better off in this position. If he plays accurately and patiently, he's better off, because he can adequately defend this e4 pawn after, let's say, the move rook e8. He can adequately defend this e4 pawn with the move f3, and it's quite difficult for black to continue to put pressure on the white center. The way he typically does this is with c6 and d5, but white has found good antidotes to sort of reduce the danger of that plan. Okay, let's go back. The other setup that black has played sometimes is knight b to d7. This has the idea that he would like to probably take this pawn, and then once the knight recaptures, he'll play knight c5 and put more pressure on the e-pawn. And it's the same as before, that now the rook can come to e8. So this is a totally different setup also for black. A lot of it, he kind of adopts like a wait and see approach. So he'll wait for white to declare what he wants to do, and then adapt accordingly, play accordingly. Okay, so these are the sidelines. Let's look at the main line, which is knight to c6. Okay, so this move is quite logical when we think about what e5 was trying to do. So we're putting even more pressure on the pawn on d4 now. And that's why in this position, white typically locks up the center and he plays d5. And now we're going to get to what I was talking about a minute ago when I said that e5 has to do with black's strategic goals. So this is kind of a roundabout way of getting there, but we'll see this position in a second. So the knight is attacked. The knight normally retreats here. Okay, and now we can stop at this position. So e5 and knight c6 were actually used by black to lock up the center. He wants to lock up the center. Why does he want to lock up the center? Well, he wants to lock up the center because black's plan in this variation of the King's Indian is he would like to move this knight on f6 either to d7 or e8 and then get his f-pawn moving. And he'll move that knight back to f6 later on, and he's trying to generate a kingside attack and basically checkmate the white king as quickly as possible. And so normally in this position, white's plan is to play on the queen side. So he would like to play moves like b4, a4, and start to create weaknesses on the black queen side. And he's hoping that this will offset any kingside pressure that black tries to make with the future moves and with that f5 break. So basically, a good way to think about this is it is a race position. Whoever accomplishes their goal as far as white's queenside play compared to black's kingside play is going to win the race, and normally that will decide the game. So we see a lot of games from the King's Indian where it looks like black has a strong kingside attack, but then white breaks through on the queen side that much quicker, and he starts to create threats or exchange queens. That's a big one. If white's able to exchange queens in a lot of these positions, black will just be left with a very, very weak pawn structure. And I know I'm speaking abstractly, but I think this is a good way to sort of get an idea of how things play out from this position after knight e7. So I made the move b4 here, and I was talking sort of abstractly there about the long-term plan, but actually this move has become extremely popular for white. This is the so-called bayonet attack. And so this is one of white's main ways to contend with the black kingside expansion plan, or whatever you want to call it, which is just a play on the queen side immediately and get his own play going. So just to give you an idea, if we look at the opening book here, black has a number of moves that have been played in this position. And this sort of goes back to the theoretical status of the opening, which is that it is a very, very, very theoretical opening, and that the positions have been explored very, very deeply, and the practice, so the games played between guys like Kasparov and his contemporaries when he was still an active player, these contributed to the theory greatly. I mean, you would have games played where there would be a new move on move 19 and things like that, and it could change the whole evaluation of the opening. So it's really that type of opening. It's a razor sharp opening, and theoretical preparation is necessary to play it effectively, which seems to be true for basically any reasonable opening these days. But I would say it's even more true here. I mean, you need to be well prepared to play this opening, because it's sort of like a lot of Sicilians. One wrong move can spell disaster in these types of positions. So let's go back for a second, and I'll use this opening book just for a second because I think it's a good illustration of all the choices. So, okay, I mean, this is obviously a huge number of moves, and most of them are reasonable moves. Some of them, if you can see under this N, which means the number of times that it appears in the opening book, some of them have only been played a few times, so we're not going to focus on those too much. But I wanted to focus on a couple of moves. So I wanted to focus on B4, the bayonet attack, and then I wanted to focus on this other idea of moving this F3 knight. Now, usually it goes back to E1 here, so we'll deal with that now. And now you see what I was talking about before, which is that Black wants to move this F6 knight immediately in preparation for F5. So let's say he plays knight to D7. And why did we move this F3 knight back here to E1? Well, actually, we did that because White wants to answer the move F5 with F3 in a lot of positions and maintain his center. And also the knight is going to go from E1 to D3, and that's going to be very useful when we push C5 later on. It's going to support the C5 pawn break. Okay, so I'll take this position on for a few more moves. Bishop to E3 has been played. I just want to play the most popular moves because I think it gives a good idea of the status of this position. F3, okay, and now Black will lock up the king side even more with F4. And this is a move that often confuses people, and they say, well, wait a second, he's trying to attack on the king side. Why does he want to close the king side too? Because if you close they think that if you close the king side, then it's going to be harder to attack over there. You want to keep it open so that you give your squares, you give your pieces squares to move to and things like that. It's a little bit more complicated than that here. Well, first of all, we're attacking the bishop, so we're gaining a tempo. That's not even a trivial point. It's an important point. The bishop retreats back here, so it does do a good job too of guarding this square, which we're going to use to get this pawn break in and create some weaknesses. Sometimes we take here, and then once Black takes back, he'll have a pawn here that can't be defended by another pawn for the rest of the game, and so that will be attacked. Okay, let's get rid of these arrows. So after Black plays the move G5 here, the point is that the attacking ideas become more evident. In other words, he wants to move this knight here and maybe move this knight here and then push this pawn here and just start to break through on the king side like that. So actually, by closing the position, Black is kind of fixing his targets as far as where he wants to attack later on, and how he's going to proceed with sort of building up a position where an attack like that can occur. So I think actually this is a pretty good point to stop at, because okay, after G5, I think the move that White normally plays is knight to D3. Let me make sure. Okay, well, rook C1 or knight to D3 or A4. All these moves have been played. A lot of the but notice that all of the moves actually are geared towards queenside goals from White. He's trying to play on the queen side. He's got to play on the queen side here and try to make it work like that. So actually, I want to stop here, and we can look at some other lines, because this is, like I said, not intended to be an exhaustive survey of the opening. Theoretically, especially, we're just going to go over some of the key ideas, why each side makes the moves they do in the opening typically, and how the positions can play out. Okay, so let's go back to this position after e5. Just helps to go through the moves again, I think, sometimes. e5, castles. Well, now, instead of castles, a lot of people say, well, they look at this position and they say, well, what happens if I take this pawn? Because it looks like black will recapture on e5, and then he'll lose a pawn because the knight can recapture. Well, it's not as simple as that. After black recaptures, and let's say white exchanges queens, and then takes this pawn, black is able to use some tactics to get this pawn back. So now he's attacking the knight on e5, and he's regained his pawn. And in the ensuing complications, black doesn't have any problems. So this variation is harmless. If you play the best moves, like knight takes e4, you need to take that pawn. So this is nothing to worry about. So that's why in this exchange variation, white usually plays the move bishop to g5 here. And this looks pretty dangerous. I mean, first of all, one threat is to play the move knight to d5 with a double attack on the pawn on c7 and the knight here, which is pinned to the rook. So that could be a big problem. And also the pawn on e5 is still technically hanging. But black has found some good ways to get out of this. The first move that has been played a lot is rook to e8. So unpinning and protecting the pawn on e5, and yeah, so that move is very logical. The other move that has been played, another move that has been played, is knight b to d7. So he's protecting the pawn on e5, but this still allows knight d5. But now it's not as big of a problem because the knight is also protecting the pawn. The knight on f6, and black has to worry about this pawn on c7. But he'll move it up here and attack the knight. And now it's difficult for white to find a sort of dangerous continuation, I would say. A lot of people will go in for this bishop over here on c8 with the fork, and they'll claim that, okay, I have two bishops, and that should count for something. And I agree that normally two bishops should count for something, but here I think there are some sort of trumps in the black position where we can conclude, and because of these trumps, we can conclude that black is doing quite well here. Okay, so the first thing to notice is that black is ahead in development. The second thing is that the bishop that white has gained, this unopposed bishop here on e2, is shut in behind these pawns, at least for the time being. Totally shut in behind those pawns. And then the third thing is a little bit more subtle, which is, if we go back, or let's not go back, let's go forward. What could we play for white here? Well, let's castle, why not? Okay, and the third thing is that there's pressure on the e4 pawn. Okay, the rook's pinned, so we don't want to take that just yet. There's pressure on the e4 pawn. And the fourth thing, the really subtle thing, is that we need to look at these squares here on d4 and d5, because black can eventually put his knight on d4, where it could be, not could be, it probably will be very strong. Whereas, if we go back, this square on d5 is nicely defended by this pawn. So white has that hole on d4 to worry about too. And all these things, all these factors, when you add them together, they basically show that black has a very good position here, and he has nothing to worry about. Okay, so let's go back, and then the last move I want to look at briefly is the move c6. Looks strange, because we are defending against knight d5, but we're not defending this pawn on e5. So white actually can go in and take this pawn now, and unfortunately we don't have the same trick we had before with knight takes e4, because we would hang our rook. So this is actually a gambit, and that is why black plays the move rook to e8 here. And this all can look quite strange. You know, a lot of people don't like this because we are a pawn down, and the compensation maybe is not entirely clear. Rook e8, and then white will castle on the queen side, which looks quite strange. But the point is that, well, I don't want to say strange, but it looks like it ignores this threat. But actually, the point is that if black takes this knight, then the rook will come in with a check. And if the rook goes back here to block, then it's going to remove the guard. So actually, white's going to retain his material advantage here. And if black blocks with the knight here, that's not going to help either, because now white will take this bishop and black will take white's bishop. But now the knight will fall. There's only one move. Okay, and so white is a pawn up here, and this rook here on e8 is a huge problem for black because of this pin that it exerts on the knight. So the knight won't be able to get developed anytime soon, and so black's position's really difficult here. Okay, so let's go back. That was the exchange variation, and I think we'll just continue on the theme of this setup for today. So in other words, positions after bishop e2 and e5, what can white do here that is different from before, or from the other positions we've looked at? Okay, another idea here is to play the move bishop to e3. This is the Gligorich variation, named after the Grand Master who unfortunately passed away fairly recently. And this move has a very clever idea, which is that if black just goes into autopilot here with knight c6, like we saw before after white castled, instead of played bishop to e3, black will now play d5 just as before. The knight will retreat just as before. But now white finds time to play the move knight to d2. And this setup is always ideal for white in the King's Indian classical variation. And the setup is where the bishop is in front of the knight like this. Because as we saw in the other line, black had to spend a number of moves, white had to spend a number of moves achieving this, but now he's already done that to begin with. So he's saved time on the other variation. So if black played knight d7 as before, white castles, f5, f3, and now black has wasted time, and white will be able to use that time to make the thematic pushes here on the queen side, and maybe after b4, knight b3 to support c5. It's all geared towards supporting c5, these setups. So that would be actually a mistake from black. So if we go back here, after the move bishop to e3, typically black plays one of two moves. He either plays e takes d4, which we looked at once again after white castles, but now it's a little different, because after knight takes d4, rook e8, f3 is really the only reasonable way to protect this pawn. Black's argument is that this bishop here could be loose and be hanging after black opens up the position with c6 and d5 later on here. So it's not the same as the other variation. That's one way to play it for black. The other way to play it is with the move knight to g4. The point being that white must do something about the bishop on e3, so he moves it out to g5. And now black will typically play the move f6. And white's tried a number of retreats for this bishop. He's moved it back to h4, and he's moved it back to d2. I think sometimes he's even moved it back to c1. So yeah, this would be a totally different way to play for black. But the point is that he's trying to get in knight to c6 in better circumstances than before, where white could achieve that ideal setup we looked at with the knight on d2 and the bishop on e3. Okay, so that's the Gligerich line. Then we have the Petrosian variation, named after Tigran Petrosian, with d5. Okay, so this setup is logical when we consider that one of black's main ideas against the classical was to play knight to c6, so he's been deprived of that. On the other hand, white has fixed the pawn structure in the center quite early. Some would say prematurely, and now black might be able to use the square c5 for a knight, usually with a maneuver like this or coming through d7. And then once the knight gets there, he's attacking e4. So that's another variation that white has tried here. And yeah, you know, there are some sidelines which I'll go through maybe one or two of these very briefly, just because they are pretty interesting. Just the creativity that white has used to sort of come up with these new ideas, even in positions where people originally thought, you know, there were maybe only one or two reasonable ideas. Like, for example, after castles, knight c6, d5, knight e7. The move bishop to g5 has been seen sometimes. This looks very strange at first. But the point is that white is actually trying to exchange his good bishop, his dark squared bishop here on g5 for the knight on f6. And the point behind this is that he argues that the knight on f6 is a potentially a very important attacking piece on his own king, and that okay, he's going to give black a bishop, a dark squared bishop, which he can't oppose anymore. But that bishop, his argument goes, is stuck behind these pawns, so it won't be an active participant in the game. So black usually plays h6 here and take, and then as usual b4 is played. So white will continue with the normal setup, and then black usually retreats here in order to get f5 in. So this is a totally different way to play the position that some people have experimented with. Okay, well, I think that is about it for this this introduction. As far as, you know, these are sort of the different lines that stem out of this position. And I know that there are some that I have not covered, but I think I sort of covered all the main ones. So this will give you a better idea of what each side is aiming for in these setups. And then in the future videos, I will focus on different setups from white. And as we'll see, he has a wide variety of choices, and the positions reached are you know, quite different in their characteristics and pawn structure and all that stuff. All right, thank you very much, and look forward to getting another one of these out soon.